Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry not to be able to be with you in person, but perhaps my regret proves me to be a human dinosaur, because virtual reality is now the equal of, or maybe even the superior of reality itself. Well, I'm going to speak to you today about the effects of the notion of rights on the moral imagination. And I don't mean here the kind of rights which, whatever the metaphysical basis of their justification, most of us would accept as being fundamental to any reasonably free society, but which at the present time actually are under severe threat. I'm concerned rather with the effect of the very idea of rights as a guide to moral and legal conduct. Well, let me begin with an anecdote. I was, for quite a long time, a doctor in a very large prison in Britain. One day a man was brought to the prison who had attacked a woman at the entrance to a church and injured her quite badly. There was no apparent motive for his action. He didn't know her, he didn't try to rob her or sexually assault her. He was dirty and unkempt, and his utterances were completely incomprehensible to others. It was obvious that he was mad, and ideally he should have been taken to hospital. Investigation into his antecedents soon revealed that he had been a psychiatrically disturbed man for a very long time, but that his disturbance was alleviated by medication, which, however, he sometimes failed to take or refused to take, and that led to a relapse in his condition as being mad. Unfortunately, owing to a strange alliance between those who, influenced by Foucault and others, thought that hospitals for persons such as he were merely institutions for the repression of people who chose to express their freedom in rather unusual ways, or ways that were dangerous to the state. And those who tried to rein in public expenditure so that the unfunded pensions of those who had previously worked in the public sector could continue to be paid. Hospital places for persons such as this man were in very short supply, and so he was brought to our prison because there was nowhere else for him to go. As I said, it was obvious that he was mad. His speech was so disordered that it was impossible to make out what he meant by anything that he said. He was clearly auditorily hallucinated, that is to say, he was hearing things that other people could not hear, and insofar as anything he said could be made out, it appeared that he was in direct communication with God. The communication passing in both ways, from him to God and from God to him. He was put in a cell where he stripped himself naked. He refused to eat over the coming days and weeks and lost a considerable amount of weight. He daubed religious type slogans using his own excrement on the walls of his cell. He would not wash, and he smelled absolutely terrible. Night and day, but particularly at night, he shouted through his cell window into the void beyond at unseen interlocutors who were unheard by anybody else. The situation was appalling. The smell was worse than that in the hippopotamus house in London Zoo. So bad was it indeed that, unlike other bad but lesser smells, one did not accommodate to it, one did not screen it out. In other words, it was constantly and inescapably present in everyone's consciousness. It was horrible both for the staff and for the other prisoners who were near him. The latter suffered in particular from disturbed sleep caused by his psychotic shouting. As I mentioned, records show that medication would quickly settle him, but he wouldn't take it. And the law in Britain, and probably in other countries, said that no one may be given medication in a prison without his consent, as this would be an assault on his human rights. For this legal provision, there is actually some justification. In a closed institution such as a prison, it would be very tempting for staff to seek a quiet life by the forced tranquilization of anybody who manifested the slightest opposition, defiance, awkwardness, or even reasonable objection to something. Indeed, this was once the case. The tranquilizer chlorpromazine, which was dished out very liberally in the old days, that is to say 30 or 40 years ago, was known in the prison as the liquid cosh. Under the present law, the prisoner who was making life so horrible for others could be treated against his will only if he were removed to hospital, and no hospital place was available for him. I inquired of our lawyers whether in these difficult and very trying circumstances I could nevertheless treat him, but the answer was quite categorical. It would be against his human rights for me to do so, and if I did do so, I should be guilty of assault. But what about the rights of the other prisoners and of the staff, who were obliged actually for several weeks to put up with the conditions that this man had created around them? Had they no rights? The answer was no. They had no legal standing in the matter. They simply had to put up with it, even though he was one and they were many. I managed to resolve the situation in the end by threatening to expose it in public. And I took photographs of the situation and was prepared to send them to the minister in charge of prisons. And amazingly enough, a hospital bed suddenly became available to this man where it hadn't been available before. Nevertheless, this is not the way in which to resolve situations like this. Now, here was a situation in which respect for supposed human right, or human rights, led to suffering, and not only suffering, but indifference to suffering by those who insisted on the observance of human rights. Even the person whose supposed human right or rights was or were observed could hardly be said to have benefited from this, unless the freedom to daub fragmentary religious slogans on walls with one's own excrement is deemed a precious freedom. Furthermore, it was far from inconceivable that the prisoners who had suffered from the consequences of the observation of this man's supposed human rights would have taken action against the infringement of their own human right to live and be treated with dignity. They did not, in fact, take this action. This was all in the days before the population had grasped the scope of the financial opportunities by means of compensation that endlessly competing rights give them. But if this situation had arisen a few years later, prolonged litigation would almost certainly have ensued. And if this had happened, the state would in fact be suing itself. Because, of course, the prisoners would have had to bring their action funded by the state, for they had no resources of their own to fund their litigation. The lawyers, with a vested interest in the case continuing as long as possible, would necessarily be funded by the state, the end result, whatever the outcome, being the funneling of public money into certain private pockets. In other words, the observation of the prisoner's supposed human right ended in rent-seeking on a considerable scale. As if this were not enough, the very man whose human right not to be treated against his will could conceivably have sued because another of his human rights, that to receive medical treatment, had been denied, or at least so long delayed that it had meant that he had been left unnecessarily to live in squalor and without any dignity. The failure to give treatment, costing a few euros, the treatment is terribly cheap, could potentially have ended up costing hundreds of thousands or even millions of euros. That is to say, the tax is raised for a whole year from the work of perhaps 20, 30 or 40 people. Against this type of blindness to consequences, I would recommend everyone reading Bastiat's essays, pointing out the distinction between the seen and the unseen consequences of human actions, including the granting of rights. I've described this situation at some length, but it might be open to someone to say that one swallow doesn't make a summer, and that in any advance, such as the extension of human rights, there is always a dark side, deleterious unintended consequences, just as Bastiat would himself have recognized, but that these unfortunate consequences are worth it for the benefit received. I don't think it's easy accurately to estimate the costs and benefits of the extension, the seemingly endless extension of human rights in any way that could command universal assent. For one thing, the costs and the benefits are incommensurable. There is no single scale of measurement by which they could be compared. For another, the costs and benefits are likely to fall on different people, and it depends on whom one is more willing to impose the costs or on whom one wishes to confer the benefits. It is probably better, and certainly no less accurate, just to take an overall view. The very word right exercises a hypnotizing effect on people. A right is in a different metaphysical sphere from, say, an interest. All kinds of rights conferred by the legislature and enshrined in law are not thought to be temporary or expedient. A law granting a right cannot be repealed, though it can be extended. The attachment of the word right to laws means that they are permanent in effect, and in the words of the American Declaration of Independence, unalienable. They partake of a Platonic quality of being eternal, coexistent with the foundation of the universe, as it were, not geographically located or located in time, that is, at least since man became man. If there were times, and of course there were, when these rights were not observed, that just goes to show how benighted those times were and how much more advanced we are nowadays. It's perfectly obvious, I think, that if a legislature decrees that every employee has the right to 4 weeks paid holiday a year, shall we say, it could equally well decree that it had cut the entitlement to 3 weeks, or increased it to 5, or abolished it altogether. But I'm not talking about logic here, but about human psychology, at least human psychology in its present state. Rights can only be extended or changed in one direction. They are a ratchet with no reverse movement. In the case of 4 weeks paid holiday, it would be perfectly in accordance with human rights to increase the right to 5, but not to reduce them to 3. Because rights, by definition, can only act in what we conceive to be our favor, and everyone would prefer 5 weeks paid holiday to 4, let alone 3, or none. As for a reduction to 3, it would be an assault on human rights, because 4 weeks paid leave has become an unalienable right, an acquis, as they say in French. It is unconditional and can only be increased, not decreased, irrespective of the actual economic or other situation we are in. And again, I remind you that I'm only talking about how people think. I'm not talking about logic as it might be conceived of by a political philosopher. Let me give you another example of a situation in which a supposed right gives rise to a conflict. And I came across this more than once, this situation more than once. A man in a block of flats wants to play his music, and it is his right to do so. He plays it very loud at 3 o'clock in the morning, and his neighbour, however, wants to sleep. His neighbour likes silence. The conflict between them soon becomes that of competing rights. The man's right to play his music versus the right of the man, his neighbour, to silence. And you can probably easily guess which side I am on in this conflict. The man who likes silence is driven to distraction. The man who plays his music so loudly will not compromise because he has an unalienable right to play his music, and because to compromise would be to recognize that in fact his right is not unalienable. The man who likes silence is in practice unsupported by any authority because the man who plays his music has a right to be housed, which trumps by far any nuisance that he may cause. Therefore, as a last resort, the man who likes silence stabs the man who likes music. I saw more than one case of this in the prison in which I worked. Incidentally, the music is always very bad music. Why is the debate on abortion in the United States so bitter that few people have been prepared to murder abortionist doctors in the name of the protection of human rights, while those who oppose abortion suffer public insult and excommunication? I think it's because the debate, at least in the United States, is framed solely by reference to human rights. On the one hand, the fertilized ovum is a full human being with as much right to life as the man or woman walking down the street. On the other, a woman has the right to dispose of her body exactly as she sees fit. The two rights are absolute but incompatible. As Kipling puts it in another context, east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. The two sides can only scream and shout at one another, and this is so because they speak the language of rights. The claims of both sides are dubious. However, if, for example, one were faced with the choice between saving the life of a fertilized ovum and that of a mother, not easily envisageable as an actual situation, but nevertheless let us try and do it, one would surely choose to save the life of the mother rather than that of the ovum, the fertilized ovum. We would not think that the value of each was absolutely identical, and therefore we might as well just toss a coin as to which we choose to save. Likewise, to insist that a raped 11-year-old carry her pregnancy to term would not, I think, be very humane. On the other hand, to treat abortion as if it were nothing of no more moral significance than the removal of a blemish on the skin would seem to me to be brutish, and a denial of the need to consider human life with some kind of reverence, and that's so irrespective of whether you're religious or not. The decision to abort should not therefore be taken lightly, and certainly not just as a matter of an unalienable right. The idea that a woman's body is her own and therefore she has a right to do with it also seems to me to be false, because actually property rights do not confer absolute rights to do whatever one likes with one's property. I am not allowed to burn down this house, though it is undoubtedly my house. If a doctor has a duty to procure her an abortion, if that is what she wants, according to this theory, he would also have a duty to cut off her leg, if that is what she wants. And incidentally, there are people who want their legs cut off by doctors for no obvious medical reason. Moreover, a fetus is actually not part of a woman's body, it is in a woman's body, which is not quite the same thing. For the moment, at any rate, though in due course this may well change, a fetus is a product of a man and a woman. Therefore, to say that a woman has the right to dispose of a fetus as she wishes is tantamount to saying that there is no essential connection between a man and a woman in bringing forth children. Man is man and woman is woman, and again, never the twain shall meet except occasionally to copulate, at most. And indeed, syringes can now be used, are another possibility. Now, it seems to me that this view of the matter is savage and horrible, though it's increasingly that of the world in which we live, which is not to say that the world in which we live is the world in which we ought to live. Be that as it may, the American debate on abortion, if it can be called a debate, is that between two supposedly fundamental rights, which, because they are rights, crowd out all other considerations whatsoever and lead only to a shouting match, one by whichever side can muster more supporters and capture the political class. These are but two, there are at least two other deleterious psychological consequences of the importance caused to rights in modern political thought or rhetoric. The first is that rights are less and less thought of being facultative. Rather, they confer something tangible. Thus, if we say a woman has a right to a child, it does not mean any longer that if she chooses to have a child, no one can stop her, but that if she does not have one and wants one, her rights have been in some way infringed. This in turn means that she has the right to in vitro fertilization, irrespective of all other considerations. In addition, the importance of rights increases the importance of the law as the arbiter of what is right and wrong, what is permissible and impermissible. If, at least in Britain, you tell someone that he is behaving inconsiderately, he's very likely nowadays to say there is no law against it. And that, for him, is a complete justification. One has a right, in effect, to do whatever the law does not specifically forbid. And what is the use of a right unless one actually exercises it? The very notion of right seems to crowd out all more complex or serious moral reflection. New rights are discovered, and none is too absurd or contradictory to be taken seriously. Newfound rights often supersede older, more important and well-founded rights. For example, in some American universities, the right not to be offended takes precedence over the right to free speech. And what happens in America tends to happen in Europe a little later, because Europeans have become decerebrate and are incapable of thinking for themselves. Incidentally, the right to free speech does not mean that being offensive is admirable, though no one should refrain from saying something just because someone somewhere will find it offensive or claim to find it offensive. Often these claims are, of course, bogus. When rights are incompatible, as increasingly they are, because there are more and more of them, and the more of them there are, the more incompatibilities will be found, sterile hostility as to whose rights trumps whose is likely to result. Legal adjudication then becomes necessary, further reducing the citizen's ability to come to informal and spontaneous arrangements and compromises based on moral considerations. Of course, it is a very important way of employing the much larger numbers of lawyers that our universities are turning out. Thus, everything is formalized, and the result is anger, bitterness, paranoia, and perpetual conflict and discontent.